Greetings and salutations, friends. My name is, of course, Charles Q. Banks, and I'd like to welcome you back to my series of discussion videos in black and white. If you would like for me to talk about a specific topic in one of these black and white videos, you can leave that topic in the comments below. Now, recently, in one of my streams, a certain person by the name of The Real Zenith, who is also on YouTube, but I don't know your username, so if you could please comment on this once you see this, I would be obliged. He commented that he was curious about the fact that so many protagonists in video games are now having beards. The having of beards by anime protagonists is an interesting topic, one that I have thought about a little bit, and one that is definitely a source of contention and division in the video game community because there are specific characters. We're talking about Kratos from God of War. We're talking about Solid Snake and Big Boss from the Metal Gear series. And even The Last of Us, Joel from The Last of Us, a bunch of characters that have beards, and even Uncharted, I guess you could say. There's some stubble going on. And the confluence of new characters coming out with beards is an interesting topic. So I'm going to talk about that today. And one reason why this is a source of contention amongst video game buffs or nerds or geeks, what have you, enthusiasts such as myself, is Solid Snake had a pretty clean-shaven look in Metal Gear Solid 1. And people got used to that, and that was his character. In Metal Gear Solid 2, he had more peach fuzz, and definitely growing into more of a beard. Not a full beard, not really with a mustache, but mainly just around here. And that was interesting because it's like, he's growing older. And then Big Boss, who looks surprisingly like Solid Snake for some reason, has a very similar design and has a much larger beard. And then after that, in Smash Brothers Brawl, I believe, Solid Snake showed up with a full beard, which is odd because Solid Snake had a certain look to him, a certain beard that differentiated him from Big Boss in Metal Gear Solid 3. And then they just stuck a big beard on him or Smash Brothers, and there's a little bit of controversy around that. Usually in these controversies, there's not a whole lot of vitriol being thrown. It's all just in fun. It's all about the art style and why the creators did things a certain way, and some people just prefer one way or another. But things like Kratos getting a beard when he used to just have a simple goatee, it is a huge change, and the new God of War is a massive change from the original series of God of War, both in its sensibilities and its art style. The story is much more about redemption and finding peace and dealing with your past, even than the previous ones were. His past always came up to haunt him, but it was never in such a familial way. It was always in more of a, my family was killed, I want revenge on the gods, because if not for them, this wouldn't have happened type thing. In the new God of War, it's all about, I want to defend my family, I want to gain freedom from the gods, and I want to teach my son good principles apart from the gods. And that's why they call it Dad of Boy. And he has a beard, and it works thematically because he is a father. And, as we all know, I don't have to go into the specifics of why beards are thought of as fatherly. Very obvious. Throughout time, beards have been thought of as symbols of authority and fatherhood, of a patriarchal sense of power, of strength, of loyalty, and leadership, determination, wisdom, intelligence, experience. And so for someone to have beard means generally, especially if they're a positive protagonist, that they are adept, that they are strong and leaderly. But that is not necessarily always the case. For Kratos, that is kind of baked into him with the beard. But I read up on why they gave Kratos a beard, and it wasn't super intentional. Right off the bat, they weren't like, okay, we're going to make a new God of War game and he's going to have a beard now. It was all about the look. They were just wanting a new look for Kratos, and they had a bunch of people drawing new art designs, as you do, and one of them, well, actually a couple of them, had him with different beard styles. Some were just the same, goatee. Some were more peach fuzz. Some were more like an actual like square beard. Then there was one art style in which he had the beard that we see him in the game, see him with in the game, and that's the one they settled on because it was different, and it was pretty off the cuff decision for the creators. And when asked why he chose that one, he answered, "Well, we wanted something different, and it struck us as having kind of a Clint Eastwood, gritty feeling of someone who's, excuse my language, but badass." There's not really another term for that works. Roguish, and he specifically referenced Clint Eastwood, who throughout his career has never really had a full beard, but he has had stubble, peach fuzz. I think in one role he might have had a mustache, but the essence of his character in basically every role that he has had is someone who is roguish and badass, someone who is really strongly experienced and of huge authority. Whenever he walks into the room, everyone kind of stops and has to collect themselves because he is so powerful and so confident, and kind of this smoldering rage or power under the surface that you got to be aware of. It's that idea, walk softly and carry a big stick. Clint Eastwood embodied that, and that's exactly what they wanted to bring in to Kratos' self. They wanted to bring that into his character when they made the new God of War game. Because he is older, he's much older, he's much wiser, and he is wizened up. He is actually teaching his son not to go into a rage, which is the exact opposite of how Kratos actually lived his own life. And he's learned to fight against the rage. So it's like that push and pull, that tug of war inside of Kratos has made him more of a tragic character, but it has made him into a man. And so that beard signifies that. Now, there's something more to this. A lot of protagonists, such as The Last of Us, Uncharted, are getting more facial hair. And there are far more elderly and middle-aged protagonists in video games than there ever has been before. If you look back into the 90s and early 2000s, PS1, PS2 era, all of the characters were generally clean-shaven. Solid Snake, for instance, was clean-shaven. The Matrix really did influence the culture, not just in terms of action movies, but also in terms of fashion for a while. The edgy 2000s black goth, emo goth, really revealed itself to the world for a little bit, and everyone was wearing that, very clean-shaven look with the sunglasses, and that influence still holds true to this day. But even without thinking about The Matrix, the 90s was a very clean-shaven era. The 80s and 90s, yes, action movie heroes generally did not have a beard, except for perhaps our man, everyone's favorite action hero, favorite kung fu action hero, Chuck Norris, sported the full beard. But he's always been the oddball in terms of action heroes. Sylvester Stallone, as well as Arnold Schwarzenegger. They all had that clean-shaven look. And that was coming right off of the heels of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which really brought back the look of the mustache. You think of funk rock, having that big handlebar mustache along with usually an afro. That was dying out. It started to die out in the 80s, and it died out fully in the 90s, I think, except for like in biker gangs, which always have that look. And now, moving past the 90s, past the 2000s, beards have started to come back because the hipsters have taken control. People who look at the hippie world and are like, yeah, there are some things that we left behind that we should bring back from the 70s in particular. But they chose to, because of the naturalistic, Greenpeace style, aesthetic, and like political leanings of this new trend, people wanted to live a more natural lifestyle. So allowing their hair to grow out. A lot of people started growing dreads, that's what I meant to say, growing dreadlocks and just letting their beards grow out. A lot of people having neck beards, and a lot of the people that were doing this were not the new generation, not Generation Z, a lot of the time not even Generation Y, it was Generation X. After the boomers, the baby boomers years, people from the 80s who lived in the 80s, familiar with them, growing up through the 90s, through the 2000s, growing beards, and then looking back to the period behind them, which their parents experienced, and bringing back that culture. So beards are now back in style, I would say because in part of the hipsters, but also specifically because of the generation that has grown to create video games and to influence the culture. They're now in their 20s and 30s, and maybe even 40s now. Time passes very quickly, doesn't it? And it is they who are now creating these games. Because, they lived through the invention of video games and are now creating their own. And like I said in the stream, replying to Zenith originally, there's also an aspect to it that I am kind of theorizing on, that these people, in making anything creative, in writing, in vocals, in music, there's always a sense of inserting the self into what you create. You cannot create something and spend a lot of time creating something without putting something of yourself into it. And so when people are choosing to put in characters or writing characters, they are putting something of themselves into those characters. And if it is true that a lot of these people creating new characters, new character designs, are that age, they would want to kind of emphasize this sense of getting older, because they themselves might be feeling older, feeling a little under the weather, feeling like, and looking up to someone like Clint Eastwood, who has this sense of elderly experience that allows you to have this kind of quiet power, while at the same time feeling the onset of age and death. And so that's why maybe perhaps the Last of Us guy has a beard. He, of course, also is a family man, but it's definitely, probably, even on a subconscious level, people self-inserting their own sense of age into their characters. And, why wouldn't you have a, badass character as your protagonist? And this also gets to something that I've thought of a lot, that people here in the West have, until now, have not really ever looked up to or respected the elderly. The elderly are beyond their prime. They may be wise, so listen to them, but, get them into their homes and leave them alone is basically how America and the West in general has treated the elderly. They haven't treated the elderly as these sages and leaders and pinnacles of human experience. Even people in their 70s and 60s are thought of as old men, as over the hill, so to speak. And so it's really shocking when you go to somewhere like Japan or Asia, China, and they have such strong respect for the elderly. And I think that has definitely been influencing slowly across the years and generations America again, because back in the 40s, there was definitely more respect for the elderly than there is now. And there's a pendulum that swings. Back in the 1800s, people didn't have as much respect for the elderly early 1800s as they might have in the early 1700s. But then that came back again in the Edwardian era, where looking like you're older, both in men and women, was something that was desired. And then, 30s, 20s and 30s, the World War I happened, and people wanted to get back to youth and spending your life in pleasure, and that's why they call it the Roaring Twenties. Then the 30s came, and everything, in terms of the economy, went to crap. And you couldn't just live for pleasure all the time unless you had tons of money, which was really hard in certain places. And so people started to get this sense of having to work harder than ever before and prioritize their lives, prioritize food and shelter over pleasure. And so, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people who grew up in the 30s, they really got this this discipline that was almost unheard of, and also kind of caused a negative sense of pride of the worm, of like, yeah, I'm poor and I know it, and I'll stay poor, and screw you, rich people. I'm going to be frugal, and I'm going to do what's right, and I'm not going to listen to nobody. Nobody ought to give me any charity, because I can live on my own free will, and I can pull myself up by my bootstraps. Yeah, getting on a tangent here, but I hope you get what I'm saying. The generations of America, at least, have moved in that pattern of liking the elderly and respecting the elderly and not liking them, not liking them, respecting them and disrespecting them. And we've been on a disrespect generation, I should say, for a very long time, ever since the 60s, ever since Nixon. We've really disrespected and not really been able to trust our presidents for a long time, or people in leadership, because there have been a lot of political leaders who were definitely not worthy of respect, even though they were already in places of leadership. And so, the spirit of America, of independence, and of the people having the power has won out over respecting our elders, for the sake of making sure that our elders are actually taking care of us. But even in art and aesthetics, the elderly have not really had a chance of looking cool or being brought up as being cool. But of course, you watch something like anime, which I am, of course, into, and the elderly are always brought up as looking, if not cool, they might be comedic, but they'll always have power. They'll always have some kind of influence. I think of Dragon Ball Z and the old man in that. I'm not a big fan of Dragon Ball Z. I don't know all the names. Sue me. But the old man in that, he's a big old pervert. He's, just the comedic relief, but he's one of the most powerful people in the show. Well, relatively. The main character is always going to be the most powerful in the end. But you see him, and he bulks up in certain episodes, and something like that would never happen in America, in the West. And there are tons of the elderly samurai who is still, very very good with his weapons, and he knows the martial arts, and he can teach you things, and you wouldn't expect it, but when push comes to shove, he can kill a room of people in a split second. So respect your elders, kids. Um, and so now that the generations of you know, disrespect, and in the 70s kind of an enlightenment, the sexual revolution, people are trying to come back to a more conservative middle ground. And along with that has come more respect for elders, and perhaps an aestheticization, if that is actually a word, aestheticization of beards, which I'm okay with. I mean, the hipsters don't own beards, you know. There doesn't have to be the full neck beard thing going on with a, you know, man bun. Man bun is the worst Western invention I've ever seen. I mean, top knot, that historical, and Japanese. If you're a samurai, you can wear a top knot, but quit with the man buns, please. Anyway, those are my thoughts on on beards on video game protagonists. And I didn't talk about video games that often or that much, but those are my thoughts. I did this off the top of my head, so sorry if I rambled, but that's what I do here on Black and White discussion videos. So thanks for watching, and thank you for the topic, Zenith. It's a very interesting thing. I might want to continue talking about this topic in maybe different routes, different streams of thought. But yeah, let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next one. Farewell.